I've come to a realization. I have a strong distaste for meta discussions. Every time I find myself breaking character to discuss Warhammer not as a story but as a franchise, it's like I'm constantly airing grievances. It begs the question, why would someone consistently complain about something they supposedly love? Well, the answer is quite simple. You complain because you care. You cherish how something currently exists, and you don't want it to change for what you perceive as the wrong reasons. But what are these wrong reasons? Again, there's a straightforward answer to this. A story should retain its integrity and not bend to external pressures. If it does change, there should be a concerted effort to maintain coherence and respect what's already been established. You might assume I'm referring to politics, but I'm not. For reasons I'll delve into later, politics don't particularly concern me. I don't believe Games Workshop cares about politics either. You know what they do care about? Money. Their primary concern has always been profit, and it likely always will be. This aspect hasn't changed at all. They might alter the setting on a whim to cater to whatever trend they believe will line their pockets more. But their fundamental nature remains the same. They are opportunistic, essentially parasitic. You've likely clicked on this video due to the recent controversy surrounding the Custodes. While I'll touch upon that issue, it's only a small part of today's discussion and not the primary catalyst for this conversation. There are deeper, more significant problems within the Warhammer 40k universe that I aim to address. These range from questionable business practices to toxic community relationships and the consistently exploitative choices made by Games Workshop over the years. This video serves as a compilation of my grievances and concerns, stemming from the fear that this rich setting may eventually be diluted, sanitized, and stripped of its essence. Let's start with something positive, shall we? At least to set the tone. Let's discuss how retcons can enhance a setting, enriching the overarching story instead of detracting from it. After such a loaded introduction, you might ask, is it even possible for a retcon to improve a setting? The answer, of course, is yes. In fact, Warhammer 40k itself has undergone retcons multiple times, and some of those were undeniably for the better. Going back to the days of Rogue Trader, the essential prototype of what would eventually become Warhammer 40k clearly illustrates this. One of the most significant retcons I'd like to highlight is the existence of the Primarchs. You may have heard that Leman Russ was originally depicted as a simple commander, not a superpowered demigod, and that's the truth. The introduction of the Primarchs stands out as perhaps the single most important and best retcon in all of Warhammer lore by a considerable margin. As a teenager, I spent days pondering these paragons of humanity, each embodying distinct aspects of what it means to be human. The intriguing notion that these supposedly perfect demigods were both far beyond humanity, yet shared some of its flaws, captivated me. Before the Primarchs, Space Marines were merely humans in power armor, not the hulking, genetically engineered powerhouses they are today. This is just one example among many other significant retcons. Did you know originally humans were capable of interbreeding with the Eldar? Logically speaking, this notion makes little sense. Humans and Eldar are distinct species that evolved in entirely different planets. The notion of interbreeding between these two species is as implausible as a wolf mating with a shark. The eventual correction to this aspect of the lore was warmly welcomed. These two retcons serve different purposes but share a common goal: to flesh out the setting, making it more coherent and engaging. While Rogue Trader is often cited in lore debates, it's important to recognize it as a prototype, a proof of concept for what would eventually become Warhammer 40k. These retcons weren't arbitrary. They were made to refine the setting, to elevate it to a better version of itself. The original Rogue Trader and Warhammer 40k are fundamentally distinct settings, with the former serving as the foundation upon which the latter was built. Change can be either beneficial or detrimental, but it always alters something, transforming it into a different form. This concept may seem obvious at its core, but there's more to it than meets the eye. The Ship of Theseus, also known as Theseus's paradox, serves as a thought experiment that raises the question of whether an object remains fundamentally the same when all its components are replaced. Recorded notably by Plutarch in Life of Theseus from the late 1st century, it questions whether a ship restored by replacing every wooden part retains its original identity. I believe there's a limit to how much something can change while preserving its essence. While replacing a few planks of wood may not drastically alter the ship's identity, the issue arises when change becomes relentless and pervasive. Perhaps you decide to alter the sail's colors or reinforce the ship with metal armor due to pirate attacks. You even equip it with cannons for protection. While each individual change may seem justifiable, collectively they result in a bulkier, slower, and less maneuverable vessel. Most notably, the ship becomes unrecognizable, sporting a vastly different appearance than before. This encapsulates the crux of our dilemma. Even positive change carries risks, as frequent and rapid alterations can erode the original identity, transforming it into something entirely new. But if good change has its dangers, what about malicious change? Well, that kind of change carries the Grim Reaper in its shadow. Let's delve into Games Workshop's notorious business practices, starting with a significant blunder: the end times of Warhammer Fantasy. The laundry list of issues with the end times warrants its own video to thoroughly dissect, but I'll offer a condensed overview. Firstly, it outright axed entire armies like Tomb Kings and Britannia, leaving players who invested in these factions with irrelevant forces. Yet, this was only part of the problem. The lore surrounding the end times was handled abysmally. Characters acted nonsensically to drive the plot forward, resulting in a storyline that wasn't just underwhelming, but downright insulting. The High Elves bore the brunt of it, with key elements of their lore rewritten to fit the poorly conceived narrative. Malekith, being retroactively anointed as the Chosen of Asuryan, stands out as one of the most egregious retcons in setting history, fundamentally altering the High Elves faction without regard for coherence. Moreover, certain factions were either sidelined or mishandled, failing to receive the attention they deserved in such a monumental lore event. The End Times debacle was so reviled that it tainted perceptions of Age of Sigmar, unfairly amplifying criticism towards the latter. While I have my own gripes with Age of Sigmar, I'll touch on those shortly. However, the crux here is that the End Times not only delivered a disrespectful conclusion to a cherished setting, but also proved a senseless business move. Given the established presence of multiple timelines within the Warhammer Fantasy universe, killing off the main timeline seemed unnecessary. It's plausible that Games Workshop sought to generate hype for the End Times and subsequently Age of Sigmar, but the execution was disastrous. Why was this decision so foolish, you might wonder? The End Times did indeed draw fresh attention to Warhammer Fantasy, potentially boosting sales. Moreover, with the launch of Total Warhammer, the Warhammer Fantasy universe garnered newfound interest, which could have translated into increased model sales. This holds particularly true now with the revival of fantasy in a new iteration dubbed Warhammer: The Old World. Let's also address how Games Workshop decimated the entire fan animator community. Not too long ago, we had numerous fan animation channels dedicated to various Warhammer projects. You might be familiar with some of them, or perhaps even discovered Warhammer through their work. Projects like Death of Hope, Astartes, Hell's Reach, and If the Emperor Had a Text-to-Speech Device were renowned within the community and served as the entry point for many newcomers to Warhammer. Unfortunately, these channels were compelled to abandon their projects when Games Workshop issued cease and desist notices and implemented new IP guidelines prohibiting any form of fan animation content, regardless of monetization. If you've been led to believe that this was merely about protecting their intellectual property, you've been misled. The reality is, Games Workshop sought to bolster their new streaming service, Warhammer Plus, and eliminate any potential competition. This move wasn't about safeguarding their IP. Many other corporations permit fans to create and share their own content, recognizing that it fosters a sense of community. By stifling fan projects, Games Workshop only undermines the very community that sustains their brand. It's a short-sighted decision, considering that these fan projects often serve as the gateway for newcomers to the hobby. Imagine if all the lore channels producing Warhammer content were suddenly shut down. It would be a foolish move, as these channels play a significant role in popularizing Warhammer and easing newcomers into a hobby that can be financially daunting. Similarly, the Astartes video, for example, served as an introduction to Warhammer for many of my friends. The fact that these avenues were essentially eradicated to promote a mediocre and overpriced streaming service is nothing short of insulting. Now let's address the current topic. Do I believe that the inclusion of female Custodes is a problem? Frankly, I don't feel strongly one way or the other. If I were to pinpoint a reason for my mild disapproval, it's because the Legio Custodes now appear virtually indistinguishable from Sigmar's Stormcast Eternals. This similarity poses a problem for me, as the more factions resemble one another, the less appealing they become, even if they hail from entirely different universes. It's the subtle nuances that imbue each sub-faction with its distinct flavor, and any changes that erode this uniqueness are met with disfavor. There's also the matter of why the Emperor of Mankind originally fashioned them all as male and sterile. He sought to prevent the Space Marines or the Custodes from supplanting baseline humanity. However, if the female Custodes are as sterile as their male counterparts, then this concern becomes moot. My primary gripe with them lies in their increasing resemblance to the Stormcast, which dilutes the Custodes' individuality in my eyes. The existence of female Custodes isn't inherently problematic, it's the manner in which they were introduced and how both the community and Games Workshop engaged on social media that's the real issue. When Games Workshop introduces new lore, they typically lay groundwork for the changes. Two ongoing examples illustrate this well. First, Vashtor's emergence likely foreshadows the return of the Dark Mechanicum, a development I eagerly anticipate due to its intriguing narrative potential. On the flip side, the gradual introduction of Primaris Chaos Space Marines. Via Fabius Bile's involvement is a change I vehemently oppose. However, the slow integration of new lore makes such alterations more palatable. By contrast, the Custodes' gender reveal was mishandled. It was dropped abruptly, triggering a deluge of divisive reactions within the community. While I can empathize with both sides of the debate, most criticism centers not on their inclusion, but on how it was executed. I share this sentiment to some extent. The introduction could have been handled more gradually, aligning with Games Workshop's typical approach to lore evolution. Instead, it was thrust upon us as though it had always been the case, needlessly retconning established lore. In sum, Games Workshop's handling of this issue has been less than professional, and as a result, the fandom is currently in flames. Ironically, the looming issue I foresee is somewhat tied to Age of Sigmar. My primary concern with Age of Sigmar is its notably cleaner tone compared to both Warhammer 40k and fantasy. They crafted lore to entirely excise Slaanesh for obvious reasons, aiming to make Age of Sigmar more family-friendly. Slanesh's inherently sexual themes pose a challenge in this regard, altering the overall tone and atmosphere of Age of Sigmar. While this shift is acceptable for a fresh setting, it would be problematic if applied to Warhammer 40k. The allure of Warhammer 40k lies in its gritty, grimdark nature, an attribute scarcely found elsewhere in media. This darkness is what drew me to the setting initially and what I fear may be at risk of alteration. The thought of Warhammer 40k being sanitized is a genuine concern for me, as I suspect Games Workshop prioritizes profits over the integrity of the setting. They wouldn't hesitate to give it the end times treatment if they believed it would yield greater financial gains. This is the crux of my apprehension and the driving force behind this video. Regarding the disregard for existing lore or the dismissal of its importance, I have a deeply personal perspective to offer. As someone from a developing country with no Games Workshop store nearby and models priced beyond my means, my support for the hobby manifests through purchasing books and audiobooks. I justify these purchases as tools for language practice and writing improvement. But if the lore becomes inconsequential, how can I justify investing my time, money, and energy into it? I'm in favor of Warhammer being accessible to all, but I vehemently oppose Warhammer 40k morphing into something unrecognizable in a fruitless pursuit of endless profits. I know discussions in the comments will take their own course, but I implore everyone to engage respectfully. I welcome discourse and am receptive to constructive criticism, but let's refrain from devolving into hostility. That's all for now. I wish you all a great week, and until the next video.